Falcha, welcome back to Irish Granny Tarot, video number 2, part 2 on our book today, The Devil Never Sleeps by Juliette Kayyam. Very interesting book about disaster preparedness. Bit of a departure. So, we ended the last video asking, what does an emergency response look like? Is it just everybody runs around like chickens and they try to get their acts together? No, it's all very well planned. There's a system called the Incident Command System, ICS. It's a hierarchical template that organizes people and resources in a crisis. It's in the book, and it's quite the elaborate chart. It's all about, let's see if I can find it here. All about who's going to do what, who will be in charge of what, how actual activity is allocated. Let's see. And that's one of the smaller charts. Its advantage is that it is universal. In other words, applies to any disaster. New York firefighters could be flown into California and know exactly what to do. They all use the same response system. Remember, this is ICS, Incident Command System. It's simple and it's flexible. It could be applied to a tornado, an earthquake, a flood, whatever. Timing is everything. When do you activate this response? That's the crucial thing. The sooner you activate it, the better you mitigate the consequences of the disaster. But the earlier you try to activate it, money is spent and people freak out if it all turns out to have been unnecessary. So you have to define your crisis. You have to recognize it early to limit and delay the consequences. COVID, she said, timing was everything. It officially began January 17th, 2020. When the World Health Organization announced that it could not be contained. This was a late response. It was met with denial. The U.S. response was terrible. And she said it's a perfect example of how denial causes greater tragedy. Trump, when he was told about the virus, denied a risk to the U.S. He didn't use the federal bureaucracy in the response, a pseudo-response, squandered January and March, and by April, the disaster was in all 50 states. Finally, the ICS, the system, was activated, but at that point, it was too late. Too late to do as much as it could have done. Through 2020, the president alternately deluded the public, waged war with governors who were trying to respond, failed to execute on a plan that would provide personal protective equipment and other resources, played politics with public health initiatives such as masking. Was the president scared, overwhelmed, unable to do his job? Did he not care? Whatever his motivation, he acted as if ignoring the virus would make it go away. And then she talks about her own personal experience of reacting to it. So where am I here? Okay, so she was teaching crisis management courses, ironically enough, during this. And so at the first class in January, they were doing it remotely, and she told the class that they were going to use COVID as a real-world example. Perfect, right? She used the ICS chart to highlight the steps in the system, which are prevention, protection, response, recovery, resiliency. And she was furious that it was clear that the government did nothing during the first vital weeks. It made her insane. She said it was unforgivable he did nothing to lower the number of deaths. She doesn't pull any punches here. Step 1 in a disaster is leadership. Defining the disaster. Define the right side of the disaster early enough and get our heads around it. By assuming that the disaster, then the either-or fallacy of success can be rejected. Something bad, catastrophically bad, could happen, and I'm going to do everything possible to stop it from doing so. But let's be real. It will happen, and when it does, I shall have a responsibility to make things better or less bad than if I pretended like it couldn't happen. That's the appropriate response. Good leadership is knowing the crisis is coming and getting ready for it. You can't play whack-a-mole with every bad event. Bad events are not flukes. They are inevitable. In a study done during the pandemic, a group of scholars who research fear and anxiety tried to determine what kind of American was better prepared for COVID. They measured preparedness not just in terms of whether citizens had supplies and food in anticipation of lockdowns, but they also looked at psychological resiliency and people's capacity to adapt. Maybe they thought there's a unifying personality type that can help determine how best to be prepared and make it through. In this study, we found that people who watched a lot of zombie movies and other apocalyptic type films reported feeling more prepared for the pandemic. It's called Morbid Curiosity, the fascination with disasters and death. It turns out that those who think a lot about bad things that could happen, she says, I fear I may be in this category, have a certain amount of fixation with the right side of the boom, the disaster having happened, are both stimulated to act early and more mentally prepared for the next unfolding disaster. Through movies and books, they become more relaxed about anticipating the worst. It did not scare them. It motivated them and grounded them. And the end of this chapter is, get your head around it. Good leadership is knowing the crisis is coming. You are here. I read somewhere, not in this book, I read somewhere else, that the people who had the least emotional difficulty with the pandemic were the people like me who had been anticipating something bad happening. I did the preparing, the disaster prep in our family, and I warned people constantly. One Christmas a few years ago, I spent the whole year putting together emergency backpacks for each of my children, and when they went back to school after Christmas, they had to lug these backpacks. They thought I was insane. But, they've got them handy if they need them. And people who kind of, their glass is half empty, people who are pessimists, people who are a little bit of an Eeyore, had proven through studies, psychological studies that they've done the past couple of years, to be actually better off mentally in their mental health than people who were blindsided by the whole thing. I don't know why I'm laughing. It's not funny, but it is. Schadenfreude. So, chapter 2. What's the word? Know what your fire is doing. In 1949 in Montana, there was a fire disaster in which 12 firefighters died out of 15. And the ones that survived listened to the one guy who saw the fire coming down a hill and lit the grass around him. And the other people thought he was crazy. He lit the grass around him and created a bear patch. And the fire went over them and they survived. Because of this, by 1957, they had developed the 10 standard firefighting orders. It's a guideline and it's a checklist, and it's full of steps to take. All firefighters know this in the entire country. It's important to know what's going on. They found from this terrible fire in 1949, nobody anticipated the fire was going to act the way it acted. For example, smallpox. Before the vaccine for smallpox was invented, there were outbreaks all the time, very common, and they would kill 30% of a population who caught the bug. In 1702 and 1703, Boston had an outbreak and the government couldn't control it, so the city government ignored it. They made it wrong for anyone to talk about it, and they wouldn't let church bells ring for the dead. They just totally denied the reality of what was happening. In 1721, the HMS Seahorse ship brought smallpox in it from Barbados, and they were quarantined at a hospital on an island in the Boston Harbor. But the sailors, some of them had already come on land, and by 1722, 9% of Boston had died. Wow. So WTW, what's the word? Is this part of this fire orders? When and what is going on? You have to prep for a disaster, and it requires the need to have information about what's happening as the disaster unfolds. You can't pretend it's not happening, and you have to know who's doing what, and you have to use this information to help drive what your response is going to be. And it's got to do with situational awareness. You need to know what's going on. You have to be able to predict what's going to happen next. Like if we burn down this undergrowth, then the fire is going to go in another direction. And you have to know these sorts of things. So situational awareness requires 3 things. And they can be done ahead of time. You have to know what's happening to be aware of what's going on around you. You have to have comprehension. You have to understand what that means. And then you have to be able to project what may likely happen. So applied to January 6th. She said, thinking ahead, as it unfolded, as the riot unfolded, they could have directed personnel and resources. They had had many warnings from intelligence. American intelligence knew something like this was coming. And the government should have had the framework of a response created. But, you're dealing with Trump. They should have deployed the National Guard when they knew that this Save the Steel thing was happening. They should have had the National Guard ready. She said if they had had them just present, it probably would have been enough to deter the rioters. Everything in a disaster sucks. She said the leaders of the response will be criticized no matter what they do. And there's a term for this in the military. It's called GOBI, General Officer Bright Idea. That no matter what the leadership does, there's somebody on the outside, unofficially, like a citizen, willing to share opinions. As in, a general will show up, the military lower guys having dealt with something. The big boss will show up and he'll say, we really should fix this. And they're all thinking to themselves, well, duh, we knew that. Thanks for the wise advice. So that's the general officer with the bright idea. And often the leaders of an organization or a government faced with their decisions during an emergency will be criticized by all the people who had much smarter ways of dealing with it outside of the situation. But you need to be able to gather information and constantly reassess it as the disaster unfolds. For example, in 2018, JetBlue had a plane on the tarmac for 10 hours because no one communicated adequately with anyone else. It had to do with the people on the plane and the air tower traffic controllers and the people in charge of JetBlue and the people inside the terminal, and nobody, they didn't communicate, and these poor people were stuck on this plane. You can just imagine. I got stuck on a plane at O'Hare in Chicago for 5 hours. That was a nightmare. It turned out there was a woman on the plane with some sort of disease. They were afraid that we were all going to have to go into quarantine, and this was 15 years ago. It was horrible. I had a Cadbury's chocolate bar in my purse. I could be a multimillionaire today. People were ready to hit me over the head for that candy bar. Oh my God, it was miserable. Anyway, I digress. So JetBlue, after this incident, eventually the people went home. They had to invest $30 million to improve what they call disruption management. They'd never planned for something like this, if you could believe that. And it was due to a lack of communication. So disasters are inevitable, but they all unfold in unique ways, and you need a system in place for real-time communication to deal with unique issues. You need to be able to shift your response. Often there's so much noise that it's difficult to figure out useful information. And so rather than no communication, you get so much communication, it's difficult to tell which of it is important and which isn't. People not in positions of authority are not always listened to, and often they're the ones who know what's really going on. There was a levee breach, as we well know, in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina. The hurricane wasn't what got people. It was the levee breach that got people. The federal government didn't know about it for 12 hours. It was flooding neighborhoods for 12 hours. People were stuck in their attics trying to make an axe hole in the roof to save themselves from drowning. People drowned in their attics. Federal government didn't know anything about it because they didn't have enough people on the ground. So the response delay cost lives. People were yelling and trying to get the government to pay attention, and it was on CNN. But the federal government wasn't paying attention. Now, this contrasts to San Francisco's response to COVID. So the mayor of San Francisco, genius. They had an early response to COVID. They called stay at home in early March. It was unprecedented. People freaked out. The Trump administration made fun of the blue city. The mayor, London Breed, had noticed, very, very astute, that the Chinese New Year celebrations, which is traditional in February in San Francisco, huge, fabulous Chinese district in San Francisco, but the food, oh my God. Anyway, the mayor noticed that this usual annual celebration and parade was hardly celebrated. They had a parade, nobody came. And the mayor said, well, why? And she found out from families that talked to people, that families who had relatives in China and had been warned already by their relatives in China. The Chinese community was scared and it was staying home. It had put itself under its own lockdown. So believe what you see, but also believe what you don't see. Situational awareness. It's like Sherlock Holmes and the dog in the night. He knew that the intruder, the murderer, was known to the dog because the dog didn't bark. You have to be open to the noise. Don't ignore excessive information because some of that information may be important and it may reveal inequalities. It may be coming from communities that are dismissed, but they might know what's going on. So this is a guy called Alan Mcdonald, the man who knew too much, an engineer whistleblower who worried about the bad O-ring on the Challenger, and he was dismissed due to the NASA culture of ego and politics. And this is really interesting. He worked as an engineering firm, Morton Feichel, and had been contracted to NASA to work on the shuttle. And at the Space Center that morning, January 27th, 1986, he watched a shuttle he knew should not fly explode into thin air. The day before, he refused. He absolutely refused to sign the official form required to be submitted before flight. Quote, I made the smartest decision I ever made in my life, McDonald said. I refused to sign it. I just thought we were taking risks we shouldn't be taking. And higher-ups signed it. If anything happens to this launch, I would not want to be the person that has to stand in front of a board of inquiry to explain why we launched, he said. He was the outsider strenuously opposing the launch with his team of engineers. But throughout, he was in the cheap seats in the back, dismissed by NASA. Eventually overruled by executives after NASA officials pressed them for a signature. It was easy for NASA to sideline him. But his courage went further. His famous moment before the independent commission investigating the explosion is the stuff movies are made of. Listening to NASA's deception after deception at the hearing, he stood up. He was not a witness. He was not scheduled to be a witness and was just watching in the spectator area. He got to his feet in the middle of this formal thing. He just stood up and said, so I think this presidential commission should know that Morton Feichel, the company, was so concerned that we recommended not launching below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And we put that in writing and we sent it to NASA. He related from the audience. It was only at that moment the investigation started to examine the O-rings, McDonald's efforts to stop the launch, and NASA's cover-ups. Nonetheless, he was demoted, was brought back only after a political investigation. In some sort of vindication, he was eventually put in charge of redesigning the O-ring booster rocket joints. Of course, the issue of the Challenger disaster is so much bigger than McDonald's status as a contractor, the guy in the cheap seats. NASA was under tremendous pressure to get a teacher up in space for the first time. Christa Mcauliffe, a mother, was a household name by then. The State of the Union was the day after the launch. And who are we going to talk about? There was a political incentive to get the shuttle in the air so President Ronald Reagan could speak about it, brag about it. The agency was hell-bent on mission accomplished. McDonald recalls how he was always in the back seat, easily overruled, with no power to shift the institution he loved so dearly. He was just noise. So she calls this Cassandra's curse. I often talk about the fact I would, God, I hope Denise doesn't mind me invoking her name here, but I think this is true for a lot of card readers, not, on YouTube. Oftentimes they will have, and I know Denise struggles with this, have insight that's not a happy story, and there's that struggle about putting it out there and having people just go, oh, I can't hear this, don't talk about this, you're going to create it by saying it, or it's depressing me and I'm not ready. And there's a term for that, Cassandra's curse. No one gets it, no one listens to it, no one believes it, it's too improbable, it's too scary, don't want to think about it. She says this is very typical in disasters. It's very typical. Disaster response leaders need data to guide their response. They need information and they need hope. They need to believe that things will get better if they react. And it's important to keep communicating on a personal level. Have a phone tree, and this is applied to families. You should have a phone tree. And if you don't have family, that's not insurmountable. You should make friends with your neighbors, have friends, have somebody, even people, like if you're in a church or in an organization, have a list of numbers to which you are connected in case of some sort of disaster. And if you do have family that are out of state or out of the city, it's really good to have a plan of communication figured out so that, for me, I'm in earthquake country. If there's a big earthquake, who do I call to let people know I'm okay? That kind of thing. So it's important to keep communication on a personal level, family, friends, and neighbors. You have to get comfortable, she said. This is her advice. You have to get comfortable speaking out about doom and gloom. It's not going to make it happen. It's going to happen anyway, in some form or another. We have to get real about this. Info has to flow. It has to be embraced. It has to be accepted if you have any chance of acting on it and mitigating the negative consequences. We need to know exactly how bad something can be so we can do something about it. It's common sense. You need a process in place how to respond before the event happens so you're not left wondering what to do. 2 key processes before the devil arrives. And the first process is information gathering, that the process of how to gather the information will be triggered by the event and followed through the entire crisis. It has to be consistent and it has to be predictable. In big organizations, governments, etc., they have to have a press officer. They have to have one person who receives information from everyone. Everyone has to know that that's what they're supposed to do. And they have to plan a process to gather the information and get it out to the public. This is really important for small local governments to do. Police departments, how they need to handle a disaster is to have regular press conferences. And at the end of the press conference, they have to announce, we'll be back in 3 hours, or we'll talk to you first thing tomorrow morning. One of the reasons why Cuomo's response to COVID was so heartening for people, we're only discussing his response to COVID, was that he predictably had a conference every single day. People need information. It gives people hope. Very important. It should include a situation report. And it's called SITREP, S-I-T-R-E-P. It's used from World War II. It has to include what's going on, what's been done about it, what you can expect to happen next, what will be done about it. It fills a gossip vacuum. It fills a fear vacuum. It fills that vacuum that of no information that people will put scary things into if you don't provide them with information. And there is no need to know how they hierarchically decide who should and shouldn't know stuff. Everybody needs to know what's going on because anyone can be capable of helping. So chapter 3 is the unity of effort. It's the craziest effing thing. That's the name of the title. So in 2020, a company called SolarWinds got hacked by the Russians, and they just used a basic system upgrade that the company provided for everybody connected to them, kind of backdoored. And she talks a bit about this in relationship to what happened afterwards. We're going to work up to that. So often, preparation for a disaster is a bit disjointed. There has to be an architecture in place that embraces all aspects of the response. So what she's saying is, unity of response is important. The right hand has to know what the left hand is doing. Every department needs to know. You do X, you do Y, you do Z, and then we do X, Y, Z together. That's really important. For many organizations, there's no unifying connection. And security is usually an afterthought. The security guy is in charge of the gates and employee badges and guards, that kind of thing. And they need to always be included at the beginning of plans, and you can't separate cybersecurity from physical security. And that's kind of what happened with SolarWind. Yeah, SolarWinds. You must have an architecture in place that embraces all the aspects of the response, and for many organizations, they don't do this unity. And security needs to be included in planning and is, for example, the location of your building. They know about that. They understand the physical plant. Well, is it going to allow for a safe evacuation? And here's another example, the Colonial Pipeline, which supplied 45% of the eastern seaboard. And there was a ransomware attack. So apparently, because I had to look it up, what that is that somebody hacks into a system, gets information, and then says, we'll return it to you for a fee, ransom. So the ransomware attack shut down the pipeline, and it was the Russians, and they had no plan in place for what to do. And any response would have been better than to shut everything down. They had no backup, no redundant networks, no recovery plan. Often organizations and governments respond to a disaster after the fact by creating new offices, new officers, new bureaucracies. Perfect example, 9/11 Homeland Security. And Homeland Security actually merged over 24 already existing agencies. It just complicated the bureaucracy. But communication between these new security efforts is rarely ever unified. And new security chiefs are all worried about badges and fences and stuff. And the new technical security is worried about the network, but they need to put their efforts together. They should be unified. The nexus between physical and cyber security is a distinction without a difference, she said. TSA agents, this was an interesting example. TSA agents are trained to be unfriendly. I could have said that. I recognize that. But then they got a new boss, and he decided to actually go on the floor with the agents, watch them interact with the public for the day, and realized this is counterproductive. This is not working. So he decided to include customer service in their training, and immediately the lines moved more smoothly. There were fewer confrontations, less hassle. Interesting to be included in that part of the process. Chapter 4, avoid the last line of defense trap. This is really interesting. So I hadn't really thought about this. This is something about disaster management that I'm not sure occurs to everybody. We have this notion that there's this one last thing that's going to prevent all the bad stuff, hold it back, like the dike. It's just going to hold everything back. So, April 2010, the oil rig Deepwater Horizon exploded, and it killed 11 people and kicked off the largest oil spill in history. 4.9 million barrels of oil. There were 48,200 responders, 9,700 vessels were deployed, 18 million gallons of dispersant chemicals, 127 surveillance planes. It was a disaster. So the company had what was called a blowout preventer, a BOP. This was the last line of defense. But it failed. It failed to shut down the system in case of a spill, which was what it was supposed to do. And this is a trap. It's critical. You cannot depend on one thing being the last thing and the only last thing. You fail. It's a false sense that all is well. It's the last line of defense, and it won't be breached. But there may be other points of failure that you're not paying attention to. They're being ignored. So engineers in general planning use what's called a failure mode and effects analysis, FMEA, which is a method of figuring out what could go wrong, and you figure it out ahead of time. It's used by engineers. It's a formalized method since the 50s. They try to predict all possible failures, and they try to test the reliability of things as they go along inventing them. And it's part of a thing called the Six Sigma tools, which are assessments, those are the tools, that are used as checks along the way of engineering something. It provides analysis along the way so you don't invest too much money in a system that's doomed to fail. You don't build the whole thing and then test it. You have these codified tests that happen along the way. And you need multiple lines of defense in a system, not just one, like this BOP at the oil pipeline. If you rely too much on your last line of defense, it puts too much pressure on that single defense, like the BOP, that it had redundancies built in, but they all failed. And it actually had multiple vulnerabilities that were overlooked. So that should have been part of the planning. Here. The program on government oversight that reviewed this said succinctly, bolts mysteriously break, seals leak, components get clogged, torrents of gas and sand rip through steel, design defects surface years after devices are put to work, inspectors allegedly cut corners on inspections. Energy companies falsify safety tests. Operating instructions leave little margin for error, collide with messy and overwhelming forces. The government has some responsibility for this. It conceded and halved the mandated frequency of tests on the pipeline. And it never updated rules despite all the studies that told them that it should. In May of 2012, at a forum the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement held on blowout preventers, the National Academy of Engineering's McCarthy made a basic observation. If these things are going to be expected to work under conditions where all hell is breaking loose, they have to be tested in conditions that simulate all hell breaking loose. Because sooner or later, hell always breaks loose. The last line of defense can make us assume that once it fails, it's all over and that nothing can be done. So that's the other part of this that needs to be considered. No defense after the last line has failed is not true. The BP company, they couldn't stop the spill from April to September. They had no planning on what to do if this thing failed. They could have intervened sooner if they had a plan in mind, but they failed. They didn't have a plan. So it's best to plan for multiple failures and make the path to ultimate destruction very, very difficult. You must have a layered response to lessen the impact when there's a failure, because there's always going to be a failure. Now, an example is the Paradise fire of 2018. It killed 85 people on a single road. They had a one-lane road in and out of the community. It burned 80 football fields a minute. Jeez. It destroyed 18,000 structures, 14,000 of them homes. It burned an area the size of Chicago. So this is what's called the disastrous result of a wildland-urban interface, WUI. There was an explanation for this. The baby boom retirees were migrating to the area. They wanted to live close to nature, but also handy to urban conveniences. And their living area clashed with how nature really is. They had to prepare for the next fire. So what do? Well, there's certain steps you can take. You can build houses with more fireproof materials. You can create zones around homes to deal with the fire. You can clear areas around a house 30 feet in, keep plants away from them, or low fire plants, and water what's there heavily all the time. You can redesign roads for better access and evacuation. So this plan had interfered with nature's plan. In nature, it's normal to have fires. They occur in cycles. They create a certain amount of deforestation. They kill off dead wood. They killed off underbrush. Forests are not supposed to be really dense. The space between trees created by naturally occurring forests deprives what's called the fire ladder, which is from one place to another place to another place. The fire progress. So this avoids a single point of failure. It's a last line of defense. And it often fails. So, for example, hospitals. Hospitals don't depend on the electrical grid. They use the electrical grid, but they also have generators and they have backup generators. They're planning around a last line of defense, and the kind of planning that they do around this last line of defense is called no regrets. You have to be able to admit when the last line of defense will not work, and you have to admit defeat and retreat. And what they suggest here is perhaps people should not be living in these areas. They're not handy for evacuating. They're not safe for bringing in emergency equipment. You have to recognize when losses are no longer acceptable. Should they even rebuild paradise ought to be the question. Instead, and this is actually a thing, it's called managed retreat. It's called, by the government, planned relocation. The government does it. The government pays for it, and it has for decades. The government is willing to pay up to 75% of a home's value after a disaster to get you to move away from the disaster area when it's likely to repeat. The new infrastructure bill that just got passed factors in climate change and provides for disaster plans, adaptations, and managed retreats. Managed retreats before a disaster happens may be the best option. You have to admit that maybe we're not meant to live on top of each other inside of a forest that we don't want to allow to naturally burn out deadwood and stuff. So, Chapter 5, Stop the Bleed, Combat Realities, an example from war. In Afghanistan and in Iraq in the 2000s, the military faced new injuries that they had not really seen before in such numbers. The IEDs, the things in the road that, were hidden and exploded. They tried to prevent them, the injuries, by armored vehicles, new vehicles, and new body armor. But what they discovered was that 70% of the people injured due to an IED they were likely to bleed out right on the scene. The military needed to respond to stop the bleed. They took a while to adopt this idea. Urban warfare makes soldiers on the street vulnerable, and stopping to treat somebody right there on the spot is dangerous. So they would often put tourniquets on people, and those would lead to amputation and death. Tourniquet may be necessary, but sometimes it causes its own form of damage. Military wanted to minimize harm on the spot by training all of the field soldiers how to minimize bleeding. They had to respond very quickly. They had to adapt. And what they came up with was blood clotting drugs, and all the soldiers were given access. And then they designed new kinds of tourniquets. And it went from 70% of them dying to 90% surviving and no amputations. So it's very effective. Stop the bleed. And this is a great metaphor. You want to minimize cascading losses and recognize in a crisis that it's not all or nothing, that you can have losses, but keep them as small as possible. Nothing happens versus everything happens, and that's not the way to look at it. You have to minimize the progression of a disaster to prevent further harm. BP company could have had a second backup BOP to prevent, that's the switch to turn things off, to prevent at least some of the spill. So it's a question of failing safely, mitigating the consequences. For example, carnival rides, they're engineered to respond for maximum safety. They're engineered so that if there's a problem, a crisis, some kind of disaster, emergency, you can get people off the egress. It's designed into it. So in a disaster, you have to have a hand on the best possible tourniquet. You have to have tools in place to deal with what is inevitable. In 2013, the Super Bowl, football game, there was a power failure, and they had contingency plans to deal with that to prevent panic, because they were really concerned that people would panic. So she goes into details talking about this, and it just had to do with putting sections on separate sources of electricity and having backup lights to come on. So what happened was half the arena went dark at the same time. And they were afraid people would think it was a terrorist attack or something. So they had thought ahead, they had contingency plans, they prevented a disaster. So the idea of zombies, she says, is great for disaster planning. The CDC recognized how great it was, and so they started to use zombie mania in 2011 to get people interested in preparedness planning. In a crisis, for example, you want to stay at home, shelter in place, have emergency supplies, don't let other people in, and like in a pandemic. And Dr. Daniel Dresnev, the international politics expert, says that zombies, the genre, doesn't give people enough credit for being able to protect themselves. He says we can work together and mitigate harm. That what zombies don't take into consideration is that we have personal agency. Mitigating damage can lower the deaths and shorten the length of a catastrophe. It makes it easier to communicate and for communities to rebound if you're prepared ahead of time. So example, Hurricane Maria in 2017 in Puerto Rico. Oh my God, that was terrible. And the grid went down. Most of the deaths were due to what they call the downstream consequences of the power outage. Without electricity, people died of deprivation of food, water, and medicines. They're called, officially, the title is stupid deaths. People didn't die in the hurricane, they died afterwards. Same thing happened in 2010 in Haiti, the earthquake. More than 250,000 people died. And they only had one runway left. The U.S. military did air traffic control. There was no power. They set a table up near this runway with 3 guys with binoculars and were able to bring in and send out airplanes, a plane per minute. They dispersed food all over the country and it prevented anarchy, and it was the most air traffic that had ever happened ever, and it was done with 3 guys with binoculars. Incredible. Fukushima, that was, the result of an earthquake. The nuclear place was not prepared. It melted down from poor planning. And there was another nuclear place very close by called Onagawa. It had no trouble because it had prepared contingencies. There's a saying that we're 9 meals between mankind and anarchy. We need to extend the runway. Airports do it. They make runways longer than they need to be. They provide extra length just in case. It buys time. It makes things less bad. You have to layer the system on top of each other, system after system, to make failure less catastrophic. So maybe this bad thing happens, but because we've got this in place, this bad thing doesn't happen. This might happen a little bit. This might happen less. So it's layered. An example of that in real time now would be flatten the curve. And what did that mean? Well, that means we know people are going to die, but if fewer people get sick and stay home, because that's the reality of it at the time, the fewer people who get sick, the fewer people are in the hospital, the less overwhelmed the hospitals are. That was the point of flattening the curve. Buy time to ease pressure on the healthcare system. Think of disasters as a block of Swiss cheese. The goal is never to have your holes all lined up. You don't want to be able to see through them. You want them layered like I was doing, so that maybe this is a hole and maybe this is a hole. You don't want them both at the same time and boom, you've got a horrible situation on your hands. You want to mitigate that as much as possible. Design a complicated system so failure can fail more safely. Chapter 6, The Way We Were, The Buildings Don't Just Fall. June 24th, 2021 was the collapse of the Champlain Tower in South Miami, which killed more than 100 people. That was shocking. It was a combination of factors, an accumulation of things that usually a disaster is not one thing happening. It's an accumulation of unfortunate things that happen at the same time. Let me read this to you. We learned that Regulations were often not enforced. The Champlain Towers Residential Board was slow to move, and even climate change and the changing composition of the soil contributed to its downfall. Little thing after little thing after little thing after little thing. In a thorough investigation, the question what happened results in only one answer: everything. It was a cumulative pattern of neglect that could not withstand changing circumstances. The planning and construction of the high-rise met with building codes from 40 years ago, but those choices would eventually meet the climate in 2021. Shoreline shifts and climate change were known to increase rust accumulation and expand concrete slabs by consistent exposure to salt water. This makes concrete crack. By the early 80s, when Champlain Towers were built, the American Concrete Institution already was advising clients to better waterproof building slabs by placing waterproofing membranes around them. It was never mandated, so the salt water was never addressed. We need to remember that conditions, fundamentals are always changing. You can't just prepare for something and then walk away and it's all good. Disaster preparedness is never complete because conditions change. Sunk cost. This is an economic term, and it's an investment in a project. It's already been put into the project. You can't get the money back. And you keep at making investments because if it's worked in the past, it must keep working, right? Don't consider it throwing good money after bad. Consider it a worthwhile investment. Overcoming the way our psychology works. So in Vietnam, they committed a large number of troops to Vietnam. And once large number of U.S. troops are committed to direct combat, they'll begin to take heavy casualties in a war they are ill-equipped to fight in a non-cooperative, if not downright hostile countryside. Once we suffer large casualties, we'll have started a well-nigh irreversible process. Johnson continued his campaign anyway, each investment of soldiers and money becoming the reason for continuing the same path. The locking in of resources blinds the decision maker to both the limitations of the original investment and any alternatives to success, or at least managed defeat. So you're working with these two opposing situations. You've invested the money and it's worked, so no need to worry any farther. That's not true. You need to continue the effort. But if you invest the money and it doesn't work, do you continue to invest because you don't want to waste the money previously invested? Craziness. They persisted and throwing more and more money into, I skipped the preliminary to that. So it's called, there's another term for this idea. It's called the Concord Fallacy. England and France threw tons of money into the SST. They had all sorts of design issues, but they kept at it. They kept building a plane that wasn't quite right. And on July 25th, 2000, Air France Concorde Flight 4590 crashed, killing 113 people. It was a tragedy, but it finally forced a course direction. The companies dropped any future plans for development of more planes. They just did not have the design. So the appropriate level of preparedness is a moving target. Planning and preparation should not remain static. There is no finish line. Prior investment may have been appropriate at a certain moment, but it doesn't necessarily make it appropriate forever. It used to be that terrorists wanted the public on their side and weren't out to just create a lot of deaths. And that's how people responded to terrorists. But then came Al-Qaeda and that all changed. Our sense of rationality wasn't the same as their sense of rationality. They had a different worldview. And we assumed that we'd learned our lessons from the past and we were prepared for the terrorists of the future. But the narrative changed, and they were bragging about killing a lot of people, and they were also bragging a lot about killing people with planes, and no one wanted to believe it. No one warned the airlines. No cockpits were locked. The FAA wasn't told by intelligence. Future disasters don't follow the script of the past. We can't depend on the past experience making us adequately ready for the future. We responded to 9/11 with Homeland Security, but we have other vulnerabilities that the Homeland Security doesn't address. We have, for example, as we have now found out, a very weak public health infrastructure. We have a polarized social society, a civil society. We're enormously susceptible to disinformation. The country's crises always focus on the last one. And a good disaster manager needs to be able to adapt to unexpected events. Jim Clapper again said, if it hasn't happened yet, it isn't likely to happen. And there's this sense of laziness, saying, oh, we got this, we know what we're doing. For example, Texas in 2021, massive power outage. Texas has its own grid because Texas wants to be its own country until it needs help, and then it wants federal money. But, sorry, that was my opinion. Texas wanted to avoid regulations, so it designed its own grid. And therefore, in an emergency, it was isolated. It never factored in climate change because it doesn't exist, right? And the whole state freezing all at the same time. It thought, well, the north of Texas will help the south of Texas if there's a problem. Well, guess what? That didn't happen. There's a process called red teaming, which is a system of testing. It's challenging the system to test for all possibilities. It's a military term. It comes from one team, a red team, the other team, the blue team, and one team comes at the other team with challenges, and it exposes faulty assumptions. And it could be done as a tabletop exercise when you're not in the military in the field practicing. And it uses ethical hackers. They use ethical hackers to get into computer systems as a test to see if they can. And this helps to vary preparedness and challenge lazy planning and think of things you hadn't thought of. For example, they designed a fake state government response to hurricanes, and this actually happened, and they're doing this around a table. And unbeknownst to the government that was all cocky that they had a plan in place, the first thing they did was they drowned the governor in their test. They said, no, you can't use the governor to do X, Y, and Z. Your governor drowned in this hurricane. And the team were like, oh, where's the lieutenant governor? The lieutenant governor hadn't attended the tabletop exercise. So it just shows you things that happen that you didn't plan on happening. This sort of testing provides new sets of eyes. They usually use people not associated with the organization. It gets you out of your comfort zone. It spreads the challenge through the system. And you need to do this regularly. You need to be mindful of risk homeostasis. It's when we put a preparation in place, we may take bigger risks. For example, it's been shown that people who wear helmets on motorcycles drive faster. You tend to push the envelope when you feel safe. Making something safe makes you feel like the dangerous thing won't happen because you're safe. Which is crazy. I had never thought of that, but I guess it's a psychological thing. It's important to communicate in disaster, to keep learning and adjusting in response in real time, learning in the thick of it. Community groups are really important in a disaster, and people, governments, city governments need to realize they have lots of groups of people who are willing to help. Technical communication isn't, for example, technical communication is an advantage in neighborhoods. And I know there's some sort of neighborhood network of computers that people use. I don't belong. But a lot of people do. They're all up in each other's business, I have to tell you. But in an emergency, it would be very handy. So I'm going to stop here. This is the end of video 2. I may have to wait a while to let my computer juice up. I can't plug in my microphone and my power at the same time. It's not one thing, it's another. But we'll start video number 3 at the start of chapter 7. And this may be the last one. If we have a 4th one, it'll be very short. So thank you for watching, and I'll be back soon.